So IIED is the International Institute for Environment and Development. It's a 50-year-old global development think tank and policy research organization. And what sets IIED apart is really working right from the level of community organizations in the global south, right to the decision-making tables of power, often in the global north, and being able to connect those two together in terms of analysis, generating insights, coming up with solutions to challenges, and then really brokering an inclusive decision-making process. And over the past 20 or 30 years, IIED has been a leader on climate action, partly acknowledging that the most devastating impacts of climate change are in many of those communities on the front line. And we feel it's our responsibility to come up with solutions, ideas, the voice of those people in order to be able to reshape our global policies to make a real difference for them. So we've got a situation at the moment where many of the countries and communities in the global south are both dealing with the direct impacts of climate change, so extreme weather and some of the more slow in onset impacts, which is really debilitating and prohibiting their ability for growth, for well-being, for kind of social development. And part of that is down to the lack of resources that they're able to access. But equally, we're also in a position where many of those countries are looking to grow and to develop and to use resources. And really, in order to be able to tackle climate change, there is a sense that those countries need to go on a different development pathway and need resources for that as well. So leapfrogging, the more use of renewable energy and digital technologies and circular economy and so on. And that all requires resources. Now, the unfortunate position we've got at the moment is in the fact that many of the countries that we work with in IIED haven't been able to get sufficient access to those resources. And in fact, actually, the research that IIED has done has found that only 10% of the total amount of pledged international climate finance is reaching the people who need it most. And so if really for the last decade, we've been campaigning around the idea of getting money where it matters. And this is really important, just to be able to make sure that people can do what they need to do and protect themselves against climate change, but also to be able to develop in the way that I just described. Now, if you look at the most kind of persistent elements here, we've got one that is really very much at the top of the agenda at the moment, which is that many of the countries that we work with, whether they're least developed countries or with small island developing states, have enormous sovereign debt burdens. And so we found that, for example, in the case of small island developing states, they're repaying mainly to institutions housed in the global north, 18 times more than they're ever receiving in climate finance over the last 5 years. And so we're really seeing a net transfer of resources from the global south to the global north rather than vice versa. And from a climate justice angle, this is really very severely debilitating for them. I think the other side of it is that the cost of capital in these countries is often extremely high. And so, those countries paying 10, 12, 14, 15% for being able to access the kind of loan markets there, as opposed to, much smaller percentages in the global north. And then if you look at it beyond that, then there's a challenge around what are the investable assets? Can we develop the right project pipelines? Have we got the right institutional strength to be able to scale and so on? And there has been an over-reliance on the kind of international system to be able to support that rather than necessarily building the kind of capability in the countries that need it most. So we've got a multifaceted challenge here, and one where simple solutions, kind of one-size-fits-all solutions, just simply don't work. And so that's why there's been this persistence. But frankly, if we don't challenge and deal with some of those things, then we're not going to effectively tackle climate change. It's a global problem and not one that can just be solved by changing some financial practices in the global north. First and foremost, there is a responsibility that we all need to take in the fact that the countries that IIED works with, the people that we work with, have not been a contributor to the problem, and yet they're now being hit hardest. So we do have a moral authority and a need to help to help them, essentially through a climate justice lens. But, as you're pointing to, there are many other reasons as well. There are markets on which we rely on. They are resource bases, often, for example, supplying minerals and metals and other resources into the global markets. We've seen what happens when that gets disrupted. And we have a situation where there are also consumers. Some of the biggest countries in terms of population are in the global south. They are really key current and future markets, often really housing key parts of our global supply chain infrastructure. And I think probably most pressing, and we're seeing this now really hitting our pockets for those in the global north, is around food systems, where it's often the supply of different types of foodstuff or some of the, for example, contributors into animal feed supply chains and so on, that as we're starting to see kind of climatic breakdown and as we're starting to see changes in the way in which farmers and farming communities in those countries act, for example, facing more inwards to support their own people rather than outwards, that's radically changing our food system and the prices that we're seeing in the shops. Now, this is only just the start, and I think we will see that more significantly. I think there's another area that often doesn't get touched on because we feel a little bit squirmy about the topic as well, but actually climate change is leading to a huge amount of displacement, forced displacement of people. And that creates humanitarian burdens. It creates challenges for people crossing borders, and it creates a lot of misery for people. And we just simply don't have the systems in place at the moment to be able to deal with such large scale migration. And we're seeing that having multiple knock-on effects, including related to security and conflict issues. And so there is a multifaceted kind of impact on the global north here. And it would be deeply unwise just to see it as something where we can put up the barriers and it's all going to be fine, because we're a deeply connected international system and one where we need to take a kind of collective action approach. Well, if we're looking back to the topic of finance, then it's important this year to be talking about the Bridgetown Agenda and to talk about the process of international financial reform, the connections through to the Motley-Macron Summit, to the G20, to the work, for example, on designing a loss and damage financing facility. There really is a considerable momentum, which is understanding that we have a globally connected financial system and that there are threats and risks in multiple directions if we don't start to tackle some of the deep financial inequalities better than we have done, particularly if we're turning up the heat around climate. So in that regard, I think there are beginning to be a set of solutions, albeit, in my view, potentially more short-term ones starting to emerge, including around more equitable sharing of things like special drawing rights, being able to reduce the cost of capital for countries in the global south, looking at various means for debt alleviation, looking at changing the ways in which we channel climate finance, including removing some of the bureaucratic barriers to entry. And then, my organization, IIED, is involved in a program called Life AR, which is supporting least developed countries to access climate finance, not on the basis of sending hugely complex project applications, but on the basis of solidarity between those countries and some of the richer countries, so we can see real change happen fast and get money really to local communities. So there are multiple reasons to be cheerful. I think, as I highlighted at the start, there is a short-termism to some of that thinking. We have to move forward, I think, as a group of global stakeholders and say, what is it going to be? What is it going to look like to have a global financial system and set of relationships that can deal with multiple polycrisis kind of catalytic risks, where we can't necessarily predict ahead of time how that's going to happen, but we know it's probably going to get worse. And at the moment, it doesn't feel like we've quite have a system like that, but I think there is a momentum now that's going to help that journey of discovery. And I think with many more voices coming around the table and expressing the frustrations that we're not moving fast enough. So I think we have to acknowledge that for countries in the global south, there is a need to change their situation very fast. So I would like to see a commitment from international financing institutions, from some of the big private sector players, and from a set of governments in the richer countries that says actually the situation now around sovereign debt in many of the countries in LDCs and SIDS is unsustainable. It's unjust. It needs to change, and we need to create the fiscal space that gives countries a fair crack of the whip in adapting to climate change and in building a fairer future. So that's really important. I think the more we can have champions of that, the more we can have people who are coming up with solutions, looking at debt restructuring or of debt swaps or of debt cancellations and so on. That's really important, because if you look at the numbers, much of everything else that happens pales into insignificance when you compare the amount of money that needs to go on debt servicing. So for me, that is the highest priority. I think beyond that, for corporate leaders in particular, to understand that there is not just a responsibility to act on reducing greenhouse gases, but to also look at the resilience to the impacts of climate change. And here it's again not just about your own corporate supply chains, but about the responsibility that you have to the people that you're engaging with, your customer base, your supplier base, and ensuring that they are safe and secure, not just for now, but also for a future that they can prosper in.